Right, so hello everyone. My name is Nils. I am the founder of Mention, and I'm a behavioral engineer. And what this talk is about is explaining a lot of what it is we do as behavioral engineers and how you can use that for game development. You see, at Mention, we have been trying to merge the fields of behavioral psychology, game theory, and memetics to create a better predictive model of human behavior. And we focus a lot on game behaviors. And that's, of course, what this talk is going to be about. It's going to be about the psychology of freemium and the deathly difficulties of data-driven design. You see, a lot of companies have started claiming recently that they do data-driven design, and some people agree with them, some people disagree. But one thing we can all agree on is that reading blog posts and working now includes a lot of new words, and words that have become popular again. Words like funnels and retentions and cohorts, and one of my favorites, average revenue per user. And the reason I like average revenue per user is because it's a really bad word and a really stupid concept. Right, and to explain why that is, what I think is so interesting about this word is it shows some of the preconceived notions we had as an industry when we started dealing with freemium. By a quick show of hands, how many people in here actually release freemium games? Could you show your hands? Right, and keep your hand up if you use the word ARPU at work. Okay, and how many of you have a background in mathematics? Ah, okay. So what's interesting about the word average revenue per user is the word average. And here's why that's interesting. If you ask someone, would you spend $50 on a game like Farmville, most people would say no, right? And if you ask them, would you spend, say $500, you are met with derision, disbelief, doubt. But of course, we have reports of single users, individual users spending up to as much as $10,000 or $20,000 on a single game. So as an industry, a lot of us were expecting to make most of our money on most of our users spending a little bit of money. And that's where the word average came in, because we expected something like a normal distribution that can have an average. But of course, what we see is a power law distribution where a few whales contribute most of the revenue. And for those of you that know math, you know that the mean of a power law is infinite. So you can't really calculate an average here. It's not really that helpful. So I wanted to start there to set the tone of the things that we didn't know going into freemium and going into data-driven design, and hopefully introduce some new concepts that will help you better measure your games. So a few whales contribute most of the revenue. They spend $1, they spend $10, they keep spending $20. In fact, it's fairly safe to say, the odds are not bad that if someone spends $1, they'll end up spending $20. This is a very slippery slope. Freemium games are like the crack cocaine of gaming, which is why people have started talking about social responsibility and the like now. And of course, we understand that the decision to spend $1, the things that went into that decision doesn't change your next decision by very much. Having spent $1, what does that change about the world? Not very much. In fact, because of things like cognitive biases like loss aversion, we might be more likely to spend $1 again. So, and I want to try to explain what this is by first looking at what does this tell us that we have a power law distribution. Jeff, have I lost you?
No.
Okay, so what does this tell us? It tells us that people don't have a budget. Now, what I mean by that is when they start playing, when they first download Clash of Clans, they don't have a number in mind. Like, yeah, I'm gonna spend $5 on this game and that's it. Most people don't do that. And of course, this is a bit controversial to say in a room where everyone works with games, and a lot of us download games for research purposes, and we have exactly a budget like that. But I'm submitting to you that your users don't have a budget like that. And we can explain why that is by introducing the first concept of the day, Newtonian Engagement. And I say that sort of in jest. I'm not suggesting this is a universal law. It's more of a helpful rule of thumb where we ingest borrow from one of Newton's laws of motion and say that an engaged player will remain engaged until acted upon by an outside force. So what is an outside force? Well, an outside force is something like a piece of information from inside the game. So outside can be inside the game, but it's outside of me, right? An outside force can be your parents saying you have to come down for dinner. That's one of the main engagement breaking points for me in my teenage years. And of course, a piece of information, your parents, or just a change in game state, something that changes what you are doing. And any point in time that triggers one of these outside pieces of information coming in, we call that a reevaluation point. And to explain what a reevaluation point is and why it's important, I want to leave games entirely for a little while and just share a story with you. You see, I live in Beijing. I've lived there for 3 years. And of course, a lot of people that are new to Beijing, they really like going to the Great Wall. It's a fantastic tourist destination, and I've been there quite a few times as well. But when one of my friends said, you know, you can drive there, and you know, it's pretty close, you could actually drive there on a scooter. I got a scooter, and my other friend got a scooter, and we got on the scooters to drive to the Great Wall. We didn't know how far it was, we didn't know how long it would take, but we knew that if we get on this specific road and drive, we will eventually get to the Great Wall. And we had a fantastic time doing that. The weather was beautiful, the scenery was absolutely stunning, and after what felt like 20-30 minutes, we arrived at the Great Wall, which is when we first stopped and looked at our watches and concluded, oh, we've been driving for just over an hour. And for us that grew up playing video games, we recognized that feeling, right? When something was really engaging, something was really fun, and we lose track of time. But something happened on the way back that I didn't fully anticipate. You see, on the way back, the view was even better. Because now I'm going down the mountain, and I'm going south, so I can see the sunset. And everything is just amazing about this trip, except that it sucked. It was so boring, and here's why. On the way back, there were re-evaluation points in the form of road signs. Now, what are road signs? Well, they were telling me that, oh, Beijing is 1,000,000 kilometers away. And there were no road signs driving to the Great Wall that conveniently said, oh, the part of the Great Wall that just so happens to be closest to you, Nils, that's 57 kilometers away. There were no road signs like that. But now on the way back, when I know it's going to take me just over an hour to drive, and there are frequent road signs giving me feedback, you know, to go back into game terminology, all of a sudden this experience really sucked. All of a sudden I'm reminded of how long this is going to take, and probably how eventful this is going to be. Like, yes, the view is nice, but is it worth an hour of my time? And I never had any of those concerns driving there. And that's what a reevaluation point is. It's a piece of information that makes us subconsciously reevaluate what we're doing, that gives us a new emotional response to what's going on. But what's even worse about this anecdote is I remember the way back more than I remember the way there. And isn't that unfortunate? Like, why do we remember the sucky parts of a game sometimes much more than we remember the good parts of a game? Why is it so easy to write a bad review about DSX 3 because you didn't like how the game ended? Like, why is that so easy? Well, in the case of this, why I remember this much more is because reevaluation points trigger decisions, subconscious decisions, and decisions trigger memories. So all of these reevaluation points made me remember the trip more. So I want to take a moment to try to explain what happens at the reevaluation point. Okay, so we have this concept of Newtonian engagement. They'll stay engaged until an outside force acts upon them. When that happens, it's a reevaluation point. But how is this useful? What can we do with reevaluation points? Well, it turns out what happens at the reevaluation point, to borrow some human-machine interactive language, is the user evaluates the machine. And the machine is any object that is the focus of our decision-making process. So it can be an in-game item that you're considering buying, right? Freemium. This is interesting. It can be a quest that you're considering undertaking, or it could just be downloading the game in the first place. That's the machine, and the user, of course, is the player. We're familiar with the player. She doesn't need any kind of introduction. And what's interesting when we look at machines is our brains have been wired to ask 3 very interesting questions in a very specific order, and we can't help but doing it. And these questions are, what's it for, how good is it, and how much? Like, what's it going to cost me in terms of exertion? And I submit to you that your brain will subconsciously ask these questions anytime you evaluate an item, and it will ask them in this order. Because you will notice, if you're a programmer, you will probably have noticed this because you have a keen sense of logic, that you can't ask how good something is unless you know what it's for. And you can't ask what the exertion is going to be unless you know what the quality of the item is, etc. And we can translate that quickly into the purpose, power, and exertion of the item. When we look at an object, when we look at a machine, we will quickly evaluate its purpose, power, and exertion. And I'd like to demonstrate that really quick by showing you a picture. And I want you to pay attention to what happens in your own mind when you see the picture. So what did we just see here? Well, we saw a shovel is the first thing we realize. We realize it's for digging. We realize it's broken, so it's not very good, and we realize we can't dig a hole with it. This is what our brain does whenever we look at an item. The first thing we realize is that it's a shovel. We can't realize, oh, this thing is broken unless we know what it is. So, reiterating, purpose, power, exertion. And what is really interesting about these three questions is we can create three corresponding dimensions in the user that helps us explain how a decision is made. So when a reevaluation point happens, we can explain what is going through the mind of the user and what are the things that need to be in place for engagement to happen. And the first thing that I want to look at is the concept of mission. What does the user want to do? And I submit to you that the user's mission will heavily influence the perception of the machine. And here's why. I want you to picture that that is you, and that I am going to give you a car. You can't sell the car, you have to use the car. So try to forget everything you know about the brands that I'm about to mention, forget what they are worth in money, and just try to appreciate the items for what they are. And one is a brand new 2014 Ferrari. It's matte black, it smells of leather and pine trees. It's really nice. And the other one is a 1994 heavily used Mercedes station wagon that does not smell of pine tree or leather, it sort of smells like children, right? That's the other car. By a show of hands, how many people say that the Ferrari is the better car? How many people think the Mercedes is a better car? Interesting. So a lot of people were willing to, only a few people were willing to say that the Ferrari was a better car, but no one was willing to say that the Mercedes was a better car. Interesting. Well, I submit to you that we can't really determine which car is better because we don't know what the car is for. If I add a piece of information here that, for example, you have to drive all this luggage and your spouse and those stinky kids to the airport, then all of a sudden, the Mercedes makes more sense. The Mercedes is the better car. If we forget everything we've been taught culturally about these brands, the Mercedes is the better car for this mission. So it teaches us that mission matters. What the user wants to do is really important. And for those of you that are thinking ahead, yes, mission will have to match with purpose. That's really important. The second thing that I want to look at is mastery, or how good the user is, how skilled is the user. And mastery is the resources that the user has at her disposal. And what could resources be? It could be anything from her intelligence, to her strength, to her length, to her experience, to her money, to how good she is with pointing and clicking. These things are mastery. And that's really important too, which we will illustrate with an example here. I want you to picture again that this is you, striking likeness, and you are going to dig a really, really deep hole, let's say 6 meters. And I am going to let you choose between two shovels. The first one is a sandbox shovel. It's very small, it displaces a very small amount of dirt in one go, but it weighs almost nothing, it's very easy to operate. And the other shovel is a standard garden variety shovel. Like, we've all used those. It can displace a lot more dirt, but it's also a lot heavier. And because there's a certain homogeneity of resources in this room, we all are roughly the same strength, we all are roughly the same length, and we are all roughly as intelligent, we would probably all choose the bigger shovel to dig a really, really deep hole. And that makes sense up until the point where you ask a 3-year-old to dig that hole for you. I don't recommend that, there are laws against it. but they would probably use the other shovel, right? Because that would be better for them. If you ask them to use the big shovel, they wouldn't get anything done, and someone is going to call Child Protective Services for sure. And finally, if you're Hagrid, none of these shovels is really gonna fit you. So we understand that mastery matters as well. And I'd like to give an example from the game world to show how mastery matters as well. I lost a considerable part of my teenage years playing Quake 3. And most of the time I played Quake 3 over local area network with just one friend who was much better than me, which is usually the case when I play computer games. And he liked an open space map where there were hardly any walls, so he used the railgun, of course. For those of you that play Quake 3, you understand why this is a good choice. If you're a good player, the damage per second that that weapon can dish out is unparalleled. So he used the railgun, but I couldn't hit him at all. So I had to use the rocket launcher and aim for his feet. So if I missed, I'd hit the ground and maybe do a bit of damage, right? So the typical game, he would frag me 10 times for every time I fragged him. And we can see that the rocket launcher is the better choice for me, but what gets even more interesting is when we played a game mode where we both had to use the railgun, and he would frag me 30 times for every one kill I get, but if we both used the rocket launcher, which is the wrong tool for the task for him, all of a sudden it's sort of evened out. And if we go back to that hole, if you imagine that you had to dig a really, really deep hole with that first small shovel and you're up against a really, really committed 3-year-old, you're not going to finish that any faster than the 3-year-old. And finally, we need to understand the anticipation of the reward. Why is the user doing this? And the why is not, oh, she wants to go to the airport. That's not why. The why is the emotional state that is expected. I'm driving my husband to the airport because otherwise I will not hear the end of it, right? That's the kind of emotional response that it's an emotional state of mind that they have, that they're picturing that they will get out of it. And of course, the reward needs to be proportional to the exertion. So the anticipation of reward needs to be somewhat proportional to the tolerance for exertion. And we call this the evaluation matrix. Mission must match with purpose, and that's the first thing that must happen for engagement to happen. Mastery must match with power, and that's the second thing that must happen for engagement to happen. And finally, reward must match with exertion, and that is the last thing that will happen. And what's interesting about this is, since these questions are always asked in this order, if you fail this pair at some point, you might not even get to the bottom, which explains things like why sometimes a discount doesn't move any items at all, because it was never part of the decision-making process. We never even got that far subconsciously. So how do you apply this to design? How do you apply Newtonian engagement, reevaluation points, and an evaluation matrix to design? Well, the first thing I want to talk about, since we're all game designers, is something that's close to all our hearts. I want to talk about potato chips. And I want you to picture two different scenarios here. One is a bottomless bowl of potato chips, and one is an unlimited supply of potato chip bags. I will give you as many bags as you want. Either way, there's just no limit to how many potato chips you can eat. And I want to ask you, by a show of hands, does anyone believe that there would be a difference in how much you would eat depending on which scenario I offered you? Show your hands if you think there's going to be a difference. Right, lady, which one do you think is going to make you eat more? That's right, the bottomless bowl makes you eat more, and this is an experiment that has actually been performed. Sadly, not with potato chips, but with soup, because science can be boring. And what they did is they made a bowl that would never be more than half empty, right? So people would just keep eating and keep eating. In fact, they kept eating for so long that some people had to abort the experiment and be like, for health reasons, you have to stop, right? People just kept eating. And on average, they ate about twice as much as the people that were just offered normal bowls of soup. And can we explain that? Well, yes, we can with Newtonian engagement. An engaged player will remain engaged until acted upon by an outside force, like a piece of information that, hey, you are done eating your bowl of soup. When that doesn't happen, when we never have to update what the decisions we made in our evaluation matrix, we just keep eating. This is what Newtonian engagement is about, and a lot of things in games happen the same way. But there's something about this soup anecdote that is even more interesting, And it's that the subjects ate much more, but they also felt less full. People ate twice as much, but were much less likely to report feeling full. Doesn't that blow your mind, how stupid our brain is? Like, it's absolutely amazing. And designs like this are used all the time, where we trick people with reevaluation points. In fact, it happens with potato chips. Potato chips are filled with air, not because it protects the chips from breaking, but because it makes the bag look bigger. So when we first evaluate the bag with our evaluation matrix subconsciously, we have an idea of how many potato chips we're going to eat. And the reevaluation point happens earlier than expected. It's sort of like the soup bowl was leaking from the bottom. It's like, oh, I finished this already? Well, I'm still hungry. So you're much more likely to buy another bag of potato chips. They inflate the size of the bag to trick you into feeling dissatisfied with what you're eating. They're giving you less than you were anticipating. And if you ever go shopping in a high-end mall, you might notice that a lot of them don't have clocks anywhere. Because they don't want you to be like, oh, it's 4 o'clock already, I should be going home. They don't want you to have a reevaluation point. They don't want you to get any piece of information that will change the fact that a player that is engaged will remain engaged until acted upon by an outside force. So now let's try to apply this to design and talk about onboarding. Using these 3 concepts, we can very quickly learn 3 important things about onboarding. 1, we should communicate purpose early. Well, what does that mean? Well, if your game is a decoration game, where it's about buying the prettiest, frilliest hats and the like, it's important that your users know that that's what it's about. If the mission that you think users will have is, I want to come in there and I want to express myself and my sense of style, or I want to explore my creativity, you need to communicate that that's the purpose of your game. Oh, you want to express your style? You can do that very well with this game. You need to communicate the power of your machine, your game, your in-game item early, to make them understand that, okay, what I came for, the mission that I came for, this machine has the power required to deliver the expected result. And it's very important to think about the time to first relevant reward. What do I mean by relevant reward? Well, I mean things that are not like gamification. Gamification gives you a lot of irrelevant rewards, things that are not tied to your mission. Hey, you just signed on 3 times, so here's a badge, right? A lot of people claim that this increases engagement, but if you do any real research on these gamification companies, you'll find that they have a very, very poor track record, because rewards don't work that way. You need to be given a reward that is tied to the mission that you came for. So a good onboarding process is an onboarding process that gives you a relevant reward early on, something that is tied to why the user first came. And looking at the evaluation matrix, we see that there's a whole landscape of things that we normally don't think about when improving onboarding. Of course, we can do things like improve purpose, power, and exertion, right? But we can actually do things to the user as well. And those are the things that we are very interested in as behavioral engineers, because you can actually modify the missions of the user by using their cognitive biases and something we call attention scope, which we will be talking about later today. And you can, of course, artificially increase or decrease the player's mastery or their perception of mastery. And you can change their anticipation of reward, something that one of my favorite games of all time, Diablo 2, did very well. And I'll spend considerable amount of time today talking about Diablo 2. So wrapping up onboarding, I'm speaking way too loud for these microphones. How are we communicating the values of our machine? This is something we should ask ourselves when we work with onboarding. We should ask ourselves, what are the first reevaluation points and how are they performing? And for those of you that are doing data-driven design, here's an experiment to do. Try this at home, please. Try to do a funnel analysis on your reevaluation points. I think you'll find it very, very interesting doing funnel analysis on reevaluation points instead of on screens, because screens don't tell you very much about what's going on. What's interesting with reevaluation points, if you see a point of drop-off at a certain reevaluation point, you can use the evaluation matrix to understand what might have happened. And finally, we need to ask ourselves, how are we influencing the user? And I'd like to share another anecdote with you. I once played Cupcake Corner. Show of hands, did anyone play Cupcake Corner? Just me and Toby. Okay, so Cupcake Corner is a game where you have ovens and tables. You're basically running a bakery. And you can choose which goods to make, and they will have different margins, and you use the money to buy more ovens and more tables, and you grow your business. And I played Cupcake Corner because when I first started Mention, I lived in New York, but my girlfriend at the time was living in Shanghai for a third of a year. And she was nurturing a very unhealthy addiction to Cupcake Corner. She would spend hours every day with her friends just comparing their stores. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to spend more time with my girlfriend. So of all the machines at my disposal, the most powerful one was Cupcake Corner. That was a way for me to just communicate with her. And you know, what gamer guy doesn't want to spend time with his girlfriend playing computer games? So I started playing, but I quickly realized that there was a problem. You see, they started 2-3 weeks before me. So even after I'd started playing, I was not a part of the conversation. They were making decisions that were not relevant to me. I was making decisions that they were already bored with. I didn't have access to the kind of content that they had. So my mission changed. And this is important because my mission changed to I need to catch up with these people so I can get what I originally came for, right? My mission was altered by the fact that other people had started before me and their approval was important to me. So because I have the level of mastery that I have, because I'm a manager and because I'm good with computers, I opened up Excel and I made some very good mathematical models of what to do with my ovens, and I caught up in 2 or 3 days. So I was very proud and very happy and unveiled my store. Behold, my Cupcake Corner. And the reaction is, that's an ugly piece of shit, Nils. And why was that? Well, because I hadn't been playing the same game. I hadn't been decorating my store. I had been optimizing my store to catch up. While they had been making decisions about expressing their style, I had been making decisions just about cold, hard profitability. And a lot of you would assume at this point that I'm just a different player type than these people. But that's a mistake. Player types generally don't work, especially not things like Bartle types. They don't explain what was going on, but the evaluation matrix and reevaluation points do. Because here's the thing, normally when I play these kinds of games, I also play it as a decorating game. I also express my style. What changed here was that my mission was changed by the fact that the people that I played with to have a social component were ahead of me. And my mastery, not my personality, made me use Excel. So it was external circumstances, not internal circumstances, that made me play that way. And it's important that we understand that about players. Depending on who invited them to play, depending on what the peer pressure is, depending on what the game culture is, they might become different people than they would normally become. And of course, all of this applies to drop-off as well. And I've mentioned that before, and I think it's important that we don't always fall back on flow theory. Flow theory is one of the most unfortunate crutches that the game industry has adopted because it's not a predictive theory. It doesn't make predictions at all. It's sort of like astrology. Bartle types and flow theory will help you find whatever it is you want. It will support whatever hypothesis you have. It's not very helpful. And I submit to you that if in a parallel universe, Blizzard found that Diablo 2 was having drop-off roughly between levels 6 and 7, or 6 to 10. If you used flow theory to describe that, you would have to assume that, oh, the game is too difficult or too easy, right? Or we haven't educated the user enough on how to be more skillful. But the evaluation matrix teaches us that there can be other things that are wrong. Maybe I started playing this game to be a very specific kind of character. And I wanted to solve my problems in a very specific way. And what happens at level 6 is that roughly at the time when I will reach this quest, where the purpose of the game will seemingly change. Now it seems like my playstyle is not supported anymore. That could happen. These things can happen. My anticipation of reward might change. A lot of things can happen that we understand by looking at the evaluation matrix. And again, if you look at DSX, I was a huge fan of DSX1. It's arguably the best game that has ever been made, and a lot of people feel the same way about DSX. And a lot of the people that felt that way really don't care for DSX3. Why is that? Well, because in DSX3, one of the most popular playstyles that was enabled in DSX1 is not enabled all the way through. If you're playing as a stealth person, you're still gonna have to fight some boss battles. And it's not that the boss battles are too hard, it's that that's not the game you came to play. That's not the kind of reward you wanted. You wanted to solve this with your intelligence, not with your muscles, and it doesn't feel rewarding. And again, if we leaned on flow theory to explain why some people might not like that boss fight, we would just make easier boss fights and alienate the people that actually care for the difficult boss fights. So don't always fall back on flow theory. And I want to spend some more time talking about Diablo 2 because it actually had great onboarding, fantastic onboarding. Diablo 2 is fantastic in so many ways that if you ever have the time to sit down and study the math behind Diablo, I think it'll blow your mind. But one of the things that Diablo did really well is the first meaningful decision you make is you pick a character class, a character type. And of course, these are beautifully animated. They have a bit of background story about them. And as role-playing people, we start filling in that narrative. Oh yes, the sorceress that I'm playing, she grew up as an orphan and she discovered her abilities early on. And we start, filling in a story of who are we going to role-play. And when we finally make our choice, our hero steps forward and like, yeah, I accept the challenge. And that feels really rewarding too. And that's the very first meaningful decision and the first relevant reward that we get. You wanted to be a cool hero, here's your cool hero, right? And it's something that resonates with you. But here's where there's a certain level of evil genius behind Diablo 2. You see, you make this choice before you even name your character. Why is this important? Well, ask yourself, once you've named the character, doesn't it exist? Right? Once you've named it, the character exists. So that's your first reevaluation point. So what Blizzard did by not asking you to name your character until you've picked your character type, they made sure that you got your first ever reward before the first potential place where you could drop off. It's such a small detail, but it makes a world of difference. It really, really does. Because when you name your character, it exists. You can come back to it later, right? And another thing that Diablo did very good with its onboarding, and I'm talking about Diablo 2 here because I don't think that Diablo 3 was nearly as good for many reasons that we'll cover later on as well, was that it didn't ask you to assign any stat points early on. You get thrown into the game and you start playing. And of course, you'll level up, in the first 2 minutes or something. And that's when you assign stat points. But what's interesting about that is you've already played, you've already gotten a bit of an understanding of how the game works before you're asked to make meaningful decisions about the future of your character. Now think about that in classic computer role-playing games, where the first decision you have to make is how to assign your stat points. This is such an important decision, and you might not understand it. The first time I played a computer role-playing game, I was 9 years old. And I created a warrior that was maxed out on intelligence, because that felt cool to me. And that didn't leave very many points at all for strength and dexterity. So of course, when I started playing the game, I had my ass handed to me. It was horrible. And I decided at 9 years old that computer role-playing games are stupid and I'm not gonna play them. And I didn't play them for another 3-4 years until that same person who also schooled me in Quake taught me how character creation actually works. And think about it, how many games have we seen, how many role-playing games have we seen that are designed only for people that understand role-playing games? These decisions are completely opaque to someone that doesn't understand them. So don't ask people to make meaningful decisions where they can't understand the effects of them. The last thing I want to do when talking about Diablo is explain how Diablo did a really good job at managing expectation of reward, anticipation of reward. And to do that, we need to talk about chemistry. Not the boring kind of redox reactions kind of chemistry, but the much more exciting, let's have sex with our genitals kind of chemistry, the things that really get us going. And I want to explore the tantalizing connection between sex, drugs, and video games, because it turns out there is one. By a quick show of hands, just to get a poll for the audience, how many people have experienced at least one of these 3 in the last 2 weeks? Right, don't be shy. At least one of these 3. You don't have to say which one. No one has been playing games in the last 2 weeks at GDC. You guys are too shy. Okay, so to explain the connection between sex, drugs, and video games, I want to start somewhere quite different than Diablo quickly and talk about the concept of social, as in social networks and social games, and the idea that social is a misnomer, because the behavior is not actually social at all. If we study what happens at Facebook, or here in China, Weibo or Weixin, we find that roughly, conservatively, 2 out of 3 posts is about the poster. You know, you're just saying something about yourself, like, I really don't like my new haircut, right? And those are the kinds of things that you think is meaningful to say on Facebook. And it's not really social at all. You're not inviting people really to have a conversation with you. Maybe you'll get a like and that you'll feel awesome. And the other third, I guess, is pictures of food. Right? There's no real social interaction happening on Facebook, and there's no real social interaction happening in social games, because the behavior is not social. Social is not social. Social is tribal. Well, what do I mean by that? What does tribal behavior mean? Well, tribal behavior is acts undertaken to improve or understand one's position within a social group. So what does that mean? Well, it turns out that evolution, through natural selection, has programmed our brains to be really mindful of how we're interacting within our tribe, because there are some very real benefits of being in a tribe. So tribal benefits include increased access to protection, which leads to more sex. So that's great, right? And it gives you increased access to food, which gives you more time for sex, which is great in terms of evolution. This is not a personal opinion of mine, it's nature. And it gives you increased access to potential partners and allies, which of course leads to more sex. Right, you might think that this is awfully reductionist or juvenile if you're being a bit uncharitable, but a lot of our psychological quirks boil down to this biological imperative to reproduce. Any behavior where we are trying to understand how popular we are, or where we're trying to assert our dominance, etc., these are tribal behaviors. And the act of self-promotion is something that the brain rewards us for, sometimes. Which is why Facebook is really addicting. We're not addicted to reading about our friends. No one goes on Facebook to read about our friends. We go on Facebook to see how many likes we got. That's what it's about. That's what releases the goody, juicy chemicals in our brain that we like, right? And I want to show that self-promotion does not always feel good, and that this is important to understand as well. So I want to do another raise your hand game. I'm going to ask a couple of different kinds of questions, and I want you to raise your hands to respond to me. And remember, we are actually taping this, so if you lie, it'll be caught on tape forever, so try to be honest. Raise your hand if you suspect that you're the youngest person in the room. You don't have to be right, but if you suspect you're the youngest person in the room, raise your hand. Okay, that might be the youngest person in the room, very good. Raise your hand if you have visited more than 10 countries. Okay, that was very easy. Raise your hand if you have ever attended one of my talks before. Okay, a couple. Thank you for coming again. So, now let's try some more difficult questions. Raise your hand if you're the smartest person in the room. Okay, a lot of people just made this face. Why is that? Okay, let's try another one. Raise your hand if you're the most sexually attractive person in the room. Why is this funny? Why is this making us laugh? Why is this making us blush? Raise your hand if you purposefully sat down next to an attractive person. If you did that on purpose. Right, no one raised their hands on any one of these questions, and I assure you, that is absolute bullshit. A lot of you actually sat down because you like your neighbors. But we don't want to admit this, because self-promotion only feels good when it doesn't invite an element of risk. We've been programmed to understand and improve our position within the tribe, so we only like it when it's sort of risk-free. And you don't know everyone in here, so you're not going to go about banging your chest, challenging everyone, and potentially losing allies, or even worse, potential sexual partners. This is a conference after all, and we know how this works, right? So how does our brain actually reward us for these things? How do we decide when we're going to get rewarded and when we don't? And how do the rewards work? Well, here's where I want to start talking about chemistry. So substances like serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine are very tightly linked to engagement. And I want to take a moment to discuss the most commonly known of those, but also the most commonly misunderstood of those, namely dopamine. By a show of hands, how many people have heard of dopamine? Right. Keep your hand up if you enjoy dopamine. Right, very good. So, what's interesting about dopamine is, as I said, a lot of people have got dopamine sort of wrong. We all know dopamine because for the longest time it was implicated as the reason why rewarding things are rewarding. We do something that our brain likes and it gives us some goody dopamine juice, right? So let's see if we can figure out, with a room of game industry luminaries here, how dopamine actually works. I'm going to throw up 3 different graphs on the screen that shows dopamine distribution over time. And I want you to guess which one is the correct one. In the first one, we see that dopamine starts being distributed once you get the reward. You've undertaken the task, you've completed the task, and someone gives you a reward, and here comes the dopamine, right? Second one, we just completed the task, and like, yeah, here comes the reward, and that's the dopamine. And for good measure, I made a third one, where we undertake the task, like, yay, dopamine! And the dopamine is gone before we've completed the task, and it's definitely gone before we get the reward. Which one do we think is the right one? Which one do you think is the right one? The first one. The second. It's the third one. Isn't that weird? No. It is. Because dopamine is tied to the anticipation of reward, not the reward itself. Dopamine is the chemical that our brain releases when your brain is suspecting, like, oh, you're doing something that might lead to rewards. This is going to be an educational experience. This is very good. I'm watching what you're doing now. That's what dopamine is about. Dopamine is what makes you try new experiences. And what's interesting about dopamine is if you introduce a random variable reward where sometimes you fail to reward people for their tasks, you get higher spikes because now the brain is trying to figure out, I don't know what I did wrong last time, but this time I'm going to get it right, and this time I'm going to get the reward. And that's also why novelty wears off. Because as soon as we understand that, oh, I know how to get this reward now, we stop getting dopamine. So dopamine is tied to the anticipation of reward. And it's very important to understand that when we finish up our last couple of details about why Diablo 2 was so good. Diablo 2 was amazing, partly because of the sound ping that happened when a ring dropped or a gem dropped. For those of you that are familiar with it, that's operant conditioning, right? But what's amazing with it is that sound signals something to us. It signals one of those random variable rewards. We just got something valuable. I don't know what it is, but I can't wait to find out. And the first thing we do is we press the button on the keyboard that allows us to see the things that are fallen on the ground. And now it does the same thing. Ooh, there's a yellow item, there's a blue item, there's a green item. I love those things, but they're not identified, so we don't know what the item is. And now we're gonna have to gamble again. It's like, oh, what did I get? Ooh, a yellow item. Ooh, what was the yellow item? Ah, that's very good. And that's how they kept sucking you in, where they kept giving you an anticipation of the reward all the time. And in Diablo 3, at least when Diablo 3 was new, that ding sound was not even there. Why? That's an oversight. Well, because maybe Blizzard forgot that dopamine is about the anticipation of reward, not the reward itself. And as game designers, it's very, very important that we remember this. This is one of the things that Diablo 2 did so well. In fact, it did it so well that once when I sat down to play Diablo 2 for 30 minutes, then I would have to cook lunch for my sister and my friend, again, the same guy that beat me in Quake. He beats me in every game throughout my teenage years. We sat down to play for half an hour, and no joke, it was 8 hours before either one of us stopped to look at our watch. 8 hours. That's a fantastic dopamine dispenser. So how do you apply this to design? How can we start wrapping this talk up? Because I'm running out of time. Well, we need to start by better understanding player anticipation. We need to understand what are the goals of the player, what are they trying to do, and how can we reward them for that. And to understand goals and rewards, one of the best places to start, and it saddens me that a lot of people don't start here, is by understanding the difference between intrinsic and instrumental. For some reason, the game industry has adopted intrinsic versus extrinsic, which is not nearly as helpful and does not mean the same thing. Intrinsic versus instrumental is important because that has actually something to do with how your brain is wired. Your brain reacts differently to intrinsic things and instrumental things. So what's an intrinsic thing? An intrinsic thing is something we like just because. Why do I eat chocolate? I eat chocolate because it tastes really good. I don't eat chocolate because I need that many calories to give this talk. I don't think that way. That's not how my brain was wired. I eat chocolate or ice cream or pizza because it tastes amazing. Why do I like money? I like money because it allows me to buy chocolate. That's how it works. So instrumental things are the things that allow us to get more of the things that we like. And for those of you that read a lot about consumer psychology and are familiar with the works of Dan Ariely or Kahneman, you'll recognize, of course, that instrumental rewards are not very good motivators, right? It's not a good motivator saying like, hey, if you do this for $10, I'll be very happy. It's much better to say, hey, can you do me a favor? I would really appreciate it. That's a better motivator. In fact, a lot of times instrumental rewards, instrumental motivators will hurt performance. And why do we keep forgetting this in the game industry, especially in freemium? Why do we keep trying to offer people instrumental rewards? Like, if you do this, we'll give you a little bit more of this currency and you can use it, and wouldn't that be great? No, that's not great, and it's not going to work. And what's even more important is we understand that our brain is wired to understand the difference between these things. Dopamine is a very powerful drug, and it's released straight in your brain. In fact, if you use cocaine, which I'm sure you don't, what actually happens when you use cocaine is that the brain decides to go all out on the dopamine response, right? So the cocaine is not the drug itself. That's a proxy that triggers the real goodies in the brain. And dopamine is what we get when we are about to acquire new sources of reward. Dopamine is the reward for getting better at life. So what cocaine does is it tricks our brain that you are getting better at life. You're doing great. You're gonna be great, son. That's what cocaine does to you. And that's the connection between sex, drugs, and video games. Because sex is something that motivates so many of our behaviors subconsciously. And drugs, we've learned that can bypass these things. We can introduce chemicals straight into our blood or into our nose or whatever that helps us feel like we're doing great. And that's what video games do as well. Our brains were not programmed by evolution to understand World of Warcraft. We didn't have World of Warcraft when we migrated out of Africa. We don't understand the difference between virtual currencies and real currencies. In fact, we don't even understand currencies. We don't understand the difference between a real friend and a virtual friend. In fact, we don't even understand the opposite sex. Like, we're very confused about these things, and we need to understand that there's a very tantalizing connection between sex, drugs, and video games, and that video games crawl into the same evolutionary weaknesses that drugs do. That's how it works. Games make you feel like you're getting better at life, subconsciously. Games make you feel, subconsciously, like you're gonna get laid. And that's what we need to remember as game designers, that that's what we're optimizing for. We actually need to build a game that makes all of our players, male and female, feel like, yeah, this is gonna get me laid, right? How many of you design your games like that today, right? Surprisingly, no one. Well, you should be. And there's a lesson to learn here from all of this, because it turns out that we can never have enough instrumental rewards. You can eat enough under the right circumstances, as we learned with the soup experiment. You can eat enough and feel like you've had enough. But you can never quite have enough food in your fridge. That's the difference between intrinsic and instrumental rewards, because our brain was programmed to maximize our opportunities, and we use our instrumental rewards to buy more opportunities. So the brain will never say stop to instrumental rewards. It's not about if it's motivating or not. It's just that the brain will keep wanting them. We can't have enough, and it can make us very unhappy. In fact, studies show that there's no significant correlation, in fact, no correlation between wealth and happiness after a very surprisingly low income. No correlation. And some studies suggest that there's a negative correlation between wealth and happiness. And isn't that surprising? Instrumental rewards don't make us happy. And there's a lot of indie game developers here that tell themselves that every day, right? I'm not doing this for money. Dopamine only rewards us for getting more things, not for the things that we already have. That's very important to remember. Dopamine does not reward us for the things that we already have. And for those of you that like brains, like we once built a neural interface. We're big brain geeks. And one of the things you'll notice when working with brains is that the brain reacts to money and cocaine the same way. Isn't that surprising? It's the same center of the brain reacting the same way. You give someone a bit of money, it's the same reaction as giving them a bit of cocaine, with the same negative consequences. You get jaded. You remember your first paycheck, that felt great, bought your friends some beers, but getting your paycheck now, indie game developers excluded, not that exciting. It's not that exciting getting money anymore because you get jaded. And that's why, for example, I choose to spend my time playing video games instead of making money. It's just a more healthy lifestyle choice. I haven't quite convinced my mother of it yet, but I'm getting there. And one last thing that I want to cover is attention scope. I mentioned this earlier in the talk. Attention scope is quite different from attention span, where attention span is, can you pay attention for more than 7 seconds? No, you can't. Attention scope is how many things can we pay attention to at once? How many concepts can we keep in our head at once? And there's a very fun experiment that this time I really need you to participate, so don't be shy this time. I'm going to show a series of colored circles on the screen, and I want you to, as fast as possible and as loud as possible, yell out how many circles there are. And I really need you to help me with this because this experiment is important. Are you ready? Yes, okay. 1, 2, 3.
2, 3, 5, 6, 8.
Why are we laughing now? What just happened? How many are there? Come on. 13. That's right. Well, something very interesting just happened. You see, we could say 1, 2, 3, 5, 8 very quickly. 8 took a bit longer, but it was also really quick. And what's interesting, if we draw a graph on how quick it looked, how quick it was to say these things, we'll notice that there's a very big discrepancy between 8 and 13. Why is that? Well, it's because we didn't have to count to 8. We had to count to 13. If you close your eyes and picture 3 cars, you can do that. Your brain can handle 3 things. Picture 5 cats. You can do that. Picture 13 trees. You can't do it. You might not even be able to picture 8 cats, but you can picture 4 cats twice. And that's why 8 still is sort of fast, but 13 takes forever. And of course, I tricked you guys a little bit, or I helped you along the way here, because these are things that we can easily put in our attention scope. That fits. This doesn't fit in our attention scope. So we can only hold so many ideas in our head at once, and that allows us to really manipulate users' missions. But it's also another weakness we have with attention scope is that our brain has horrible tunnel vision. And I'm going to demonstrate that with a video here. So this here is an awareness test, if the video will play. No? Let's try that again. There we go.
This is an awareness test.
I have audio, fantastic.
How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
If you look this time and you don't focus on the white team, you'll notice coming in from the right is a man in an animal costume. You didn't see him last time, isn't that weird? It's easy to miss something you're not looking for. This was an advert run by Transport for London, telling people don't kill cyclists in traffic. It's an ad I'm waiting for them to run in Beijing. I think it would be really helpful. And what this shows is our attention scope is very, very limited. If we are paying attention to something that takes up a lot of our cognitive processing power, we're going to miss a lot of things, right? And attention scope lets us guide the user's mission. And again, just borrowing from Blizzard, they do this very well. In, for example, the StarCraft 2 campaign, they will occasionally, let's say that there's a map where a part of the design is you're going to get attacked fairly early on, and they don't want you to lose. Right? They might have noticed in playtesting that a lot of people lose on this map because there's an early attack and people aren't prepared. How do you solve the problem? Well, one, you can make the attack smaller. That's the standard flow theory approach. But with the evaluation matrix, if we want to change the mission a bit, we can do something sneaky, like putting a small contingent of enemy units at the very edge of what you can see. Just, 3 of them. It will be very easy to defeat them. And your brain is going to focus on that, like, ooh, I want to kill those 3 guys. So you're going to build military units a bit faster just to kill them. And because you did that, because we tricked you into feeling like, yeah, okay, I want to do that, you'll actually have some enemy units when the first attack comes, right? We can use attention scope to guide the user's mission. And I'm very, very close to out of time, so I'm going to summarize 5 key takeaways. Remember Newtonian engagement. An engaged player will remain engaged until acted upon by an outside force. Remember reevaluation points. Look for your reevaluation points. Measure them. Remember the evaluation matrix. You know what happens at the reevaluation point. And remember that it allows you to model decisions, especially during onboarding and drop-off. Use cognitive biases like loss aversion and attention scope to manage the player's mission. Remember how dopamine works. Motivation is tied to the anticipation of reward more than the actual reward itself, which leads us to the final point. Remember the player and her mission. Give relevant rewards, and remember to give a reward that is tied to why the player came in the first place. And I'm going to leave you with just a quick quip talking about the potato chips. So if left to your own devices, eating out of a bottomless bowl of potato chips, Newtonian engagement sees to it that you will eat and eat and eat and eat until someone comes along and calls you a whale. And that's everything for me. Thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to take questions.